Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
The dark waters of the Caribbean Sea lap silently against the steel hull of a giant cruise ship hundreds of miles from shore. It is March 24th, 1998. The time is 5:30 a.m. 23-year-old Amy Lynn Bradley stands on the upper deck. She is a professional lifeguard who is not afraid of open water. In 30 minutes, at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, her father will step out onto the balcony of their family cabin and see only a chilling emptiness. The glass door will remain open. The girl's shoes will be neatly placed on the floor, but a pack of cigarettes and a lighter will be missing. A person planning to commit suicide or run away doesn't walk barefoot while grabbing cigarettes. The ship's management will call this a tragic accident, convincing everyone that she fell overboard. But they will be lying. Amy didn't drown. A few minutes before she disappeared, a witness saw the musician hand the girl a dark-colored drink. She was simply wiped off the ship, turned into a living commodity in the criminal underworld, and this horror and the search for her will last more than 25 years. In late March 1998, a massive cruise ship cut through the dark waves of the Caribbean Sea. It was a veritable floating city of steel, sailing through international waters from the coast of Aruba toward the island of Curacao. The Bradley family, Father Ron, Mother Eva, Brother Brad, and 23-year-old Amy, were enjoying a vacation they had unexpectedly won the day before. Everything looked like the perfect getaway far from civilization. Amy had recently graduated from college, played basketball actively, and held a professional lifeguard certification. She was an incredibly strong swimmer. This key biographical detail immediately plants a solid logical mine beneath the future official version of the security service that the girl could have accidentally tripped over railings over 4 feet high, fallen into the ocean, and silently drowned without a single scream or sign of a desperate struggle for life. The events immediately preceding the disaster unfolded on the night of March 23rd to 24th. The liner was dozens of miles from the nearest shore. Amy and Brad were spending time in the ship's noisy nightclub. A local band was performing on stage. According to eyewitness accounts, the girl was dancing with a bass guitarist named Alistair Douglas. From the outside, their interaction looked like ordinary, non-committal flirting. However, later, during a detailed reconstruction of the events, other passengers recalled a creepy atmosphere. The club staff exchanged barely noticeable, peculiar glances, keeping a close watch on the girl. It resembled cold-blooded, coordinated surveillance of a selected target more than the usual service provided to cruise guests. The chronology of that night was recorded by investigators with frightening documentary precision. At 1 a.m., Douglas, according to his later official statement to the police, left the party and allegedly went to his cabin to sleep. At 3:35 a.m., Brad returned to the family cabin on the lower deck. At exactly 3:40 a.m., Amy arrived there as well. The brother and sister sat on the balcony for a few more minutes, gazing at the black ocean horizon, after which Brad went to sleep in his room. At 5:15 a.m., the girl's father, Ron Bradley, woke up briefly. He looked through the glass door and saw that Amy was sleeping peacefully on a deck chair. Her father did not wake her. However, it was precisely between 5:30 and 5:45 a.m. that a pivotal event occurred, one that changed everything. Several independent tourist witnesses later testified to the police that they had clearly seen Amy on the ship's upper deck, and she was not alone. Standing next to her was Alistair Douglas, the very same musician who had convinced investigators that he had been fast asleep for over 4 hours. The witnesses noted an extremely suspicious detail that had strangely disappeared from the security service's initial official reports. The man had handed the girl a dark-colored drink. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Ron woke up for the second time. He immediately felt a paralyzing anxiety. The deck chair on the balcony was completely empty. The heavy glass doors remained ajar by a few inches, letting in the cool morning air. Amy's shoes were neatly placed on the rug. However, her cigarettes and lighter had vanished without a trace from her table. Basic criminal logic dictates a person who suddenly decides to take their own life never leaves their shoes behind, but always takes their cigarettes with them. Everything pointed to the fact that Amy had stepped out barefoot for just a few minutes to light a cigarette or meet someone quickly by the elevators. At the same time, according to documented statements from other passengers, Douglas was spotted on the upper deck around 6 in the morning. He was walking extremely quickly toward the crew's quarters, and this time, the man was completely alone. At 6:30 a.m., the family fully realized the horror of the situation and raised the alarm. The liner was just approaching the port of Wilhelmstadt. Ron desperately begged security to block all exits and not lower the gangways to shore, so that the kidnappers could not take his daughter away. However, the ship's administration responded with a cold refusal. Security officers stated emotionlessly that it was still too early to raise a general alarm, and they would categorically not detain thousands of passengers because of the absence of a single person. The heavy metal doors of the airlocks swung open. A huge crowd of tourists began spilling uncontrollably onto the concrete pier of Curaçao, creating the perfect chaos for anyone to slip away unnoticed. At that very moment, 2 people were standing on the pier, just a few dozen feet from the local customs control zone. Independent investigators Thomas Campbell and Donna Willis had arrived on the island on a completely different case. They silently watched the morning bustle at the port until their gaze was seized by the Bradley family, overcome with utter horror as they desperately pushed their way through the crowd, not yet knowing that their daughter had already crossed the invisible line between the safe world and the absolute darkness of the transnational criminal underworld. The official investigation immediately hit a brick wall of corporate bureaucracy. Representatives of the cruise line and port authorities acted according to a convenient, pre-prepared script. According to their public statement, the young woman was heavily intoxicated, lost her balance, accidentally fell over the railing of her own cabin balcony, and drowned. No large-scale search operations or thorough combing of the hundreds of cabins on board were planned. The massive ship continued on its carefree course. The Bradley family, realizing with horror that precious time was running out, made a desperate decision. They unofficially hired 2 independent investigators, former military investigator Thomas Campbell and regional criminal network specialist Donna Willis. This step became a turning point that forever changed the direction of the investigation. Thomas, drawing on his hard-won experience as a military investigator, began a meticulous deconstruction of the cruise line's official version. His first step was a detailed examination of the site of the alleged fall. Sturdy steel handrails rose more than 4 feet high. For a person with Amy's perfect physical conditioning and quick reflexes as a lifeguard to accidentally fall overboard, a significant external force would have been required. Thomas methodically, inch by inch, examined every centimeter of metal and plastic. There were no microscopic scratches or smudged palm prints to indicate a sudden slip or a desperate struggle on the edge of a deadly precipice. The glass door leading back to the cabin remained ajar, just enough for a person to step back inside. Standard forensic practice dictates that people who fall involuntarily instinctively cling to any surface, invariably leaving obvious marks. The military investigator's conclusion was unequivocal. Amy did not fall. The man understood perfectly well that the real answers lay not on the balcony bathed in tropical sunlight, but deep within the liner's security archives. That same night, skillfully exploiting the changing of the guard and blind spots in the surveillance cameras, Thomas illegally broke into the restricted security office on the lower deck. The room was cool and smelled dry, like ozone from the running servers. Amid stacks of paper reports, he began searching for what the powerful corporation had tried to bury forever under a classification of secrecy. The first stunning discovery was the original, unedited reports of the initial passenger interviews, hastily compiled in the first hours after the disappearance. According to these rough drafts, at least 3 independent witnesses clearly described the events that unfolded on the upper deck. One of the hidden reports contained a tourist's testimony that completely undermined the bass guitarist's convenient alibi. The witness described in great detail how the musician handed the girl a dark-colored drink. This occurred during a critical time window between 5:30 and 5:45 a.m. From the final official reports, which were later handed over to the police, this vital fact had been skillfully omitted. But the most chilling discovery of that night was the electronic log of service elevator usage. Thomas spent hours cross-referencing timestamps with the movement patterns of the technical staff. He was purposefully searching for a system anomaly and eventually found it. A brief entry flashed dispassionately in the digital log. At 5:55 a.m., just 5 short minutes before the father saw the empty balcony and sounded the general alarm, a large maintenance cart loaded with dirty laundry had been unexpectedly lowered to the lowest service deck. This area had direct access to the airlock, which was normally used exclusively for the quick unloading of trash by port workers. At the same time, according to other accounts, at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the bass guitarist left the upper deck in a complete hurry and all alone. The picture of a silent crime took shape in the investigator's mind with terrifying, icy clarity. The dark drink was no ordinary tropical cocktail. It contained a potent dose of a fast-acting sedative capable of paralyzing the central nervous system in a matter of minutes. When the girl lost control of her body on the upper deck, she was instantly seized and hidden in one of the numerous utility rooms. The helpless, immobilized victim was quickly loaded into a deep laundry cart and lowered into the ship's hold. She was discreetly taken off the liner through a service exit, even before the official start of the mass disembarkation of passengers. The musician flawlessly played the role of the perfect decoy. Amy did not fall victim to the raging ocean. She was swallowed up by a planned operation of a professional slave-trading syndicate. Thomas gathered evidence and passed the information on to Donna. Now they knew for sure. The girl's trail led deep into the island. But the investigators had no idea what a massive and ruthless mechanism had just been set in motion in the shadows of Willemstad. Friends, before we continue diving into the details of this dark case, I have one extremely important request for you. Please subscribe to my channel, leave a detailed comment under this video, and be sure to hit the like button. YouTube's algorithms work in such a way that your activity helps push these complex investigative documentaries into the recommendations. The more engagement you provide, the more people will be able to see this video and learn the brutal truth that has been hidden behind the cruise industry's glossy facade for years. Your support truly makes a difference. Now, let's return to the events on the island of Curaçao. The investigation shifted to Willemstad, the island's capital, bathed in tropical sunshine. While independent investigators tried to find leads on land, the Coast Guard was wasting enormous resources on a completely futile operation. For 4 days, patrol boats combed the waters. Heavy helicopters flew hundreds of miles over the water, and radar operators stared at their screens until their eyes ached, hoping to spot a body in the ocean. Thomas and Donna watched this massive search with a bitter realization. The authorities were looking for a ghost in the water, while Amy was right here on this piece of land, and the clock was ticking by the hour. In 1998, Willemstad presented itself to tourists as a carefree Caribbean fairy tale. The bright pastel buildings of Dutch architecture and the crowds of vacationers created the illusion of complete safety. But Donna knew perfectly well what was really hidden behind this picturesque facade. As soon as you strayed a few miles from the central waterfront, the city revealed its predatory face. The dark, filthy alleys of the port districts. It was here that the criminal underworld thrived, obeying no official laws. Donna immersed herself completely in this environment, utilizing her network of informants among the locals. Her connections in the island's underworld quickly yielded invaluable results. Informants led the investigators to a local taxi driver. His testimony during a confidential meeting finally dispelled any doubts as to whether the girl had left the ship of her own free will or had fallen victim to a planned abduction. The taxi driver shuddered as he recalled the morning of March 24th. Just as the white liner had moored at the pier and the massive metal airlock doors began to open, a young woman rushed up to his car in the parking lot. According to him, the girl was completely barefoot, which perfectly matched the fact that her shoes had been left in the cabin. The woman was in a state of deep, uncontrollable panic. She desperately pleaded for help, looking around frantically, and begged for a phone. The driver clearly remembered her piercing green eyes, a distinctive feature from the police descriptions. However, before the stunned man could react in any way, two burly, unknown men emerged from the crowd. They roughly grabbed the girl by the arms, dragged her away from the taxi, and forcibly shoved her into the back seat of another car, which immediately sped off. Meanwhile, Thomas was conducting his surveillance near the Coast Guard building, where local authorities had summoned bass guitarist Alistair Douglas for a formal interrogation. The investigator expected to see a nervous suspect, cornered by the evidence. But what happened next revealed the full scale of the problem. The door to the interrogation room swung open, and the musician stepped out into the hallway. A broad, relaxed smile played across his face. Spotting his bandmates, he raised his hand and gave them a thumbs up. Douglas was absolutely, unwaveringly confident of his complete impunity. Thomas clenched his fists until they hurt, realizing the bitter truth. Proving his direct involvement was simply impossible legally. The corruption of the local police, a culture of mutual cover-ups, and massive bureaucratic loopholes in maritime jurisdiction created an impenetrable shield for criminals. The investigators met that evening in a cheap motel room. They silently pored over the gathered evidence and realized with icy horror. Every wasted minute worked against them. For right now, someone's ruthless hands were dragging Amy to the very depths of the Caribbean syndicate, into a thick, impenetrable darkness from which no one had ever found their way back. 5 long months had passed. August 1998 enveloped the island of Curacao in a heavy, stifling heat. The official investigation, conducted jointly by the local police and representatives of the Coast Guard, had predictably reached a dead end. Thick folders of formal reports gathered dust in police archives, and the names of the suspects remained untouchable due to a lack of direct evidence. It seemed that the ocean waves had finally washed away all traces of the girl. However, hope flared up with renewed vigor when an unexpected call came into the secure line of independent investigators. Canadian tourist David Carmichael got in touch, and his testimony became the link that once again tied the case to the brutal reality. Carmichael described in detail the chilling scene he witnessed at Playa Porto Mare, a white sand beach popular among divers. According to him, He was relaxing a few dozen feet from the water when he noticed a young white woman. Her appearance matched the police description of Amy perfectly. But what caught the Canadian's attention was not so much the resemblance as the completely unnatural, tense behavior of this group. The woman looked deeply traumatized. Her movements were mechanical, and her gaze was empty and lifeless. She was closely escorted by two burly men who behaved extremely aggressively and controlled her every move. According to the tourist's testimony, one of these bodyguards, with his distinctive build and mannerisms down to the smallest detail, resembled that very same bass guitarist from the cruise ship. The woman, noticing Carmichael's watchful gaze, tried to cautiously make eye contact with him. It was a silent, desperate plea for help. But the bodyguards instantly intercepted her gaze, grabbed her arms roughly, and quickly led her away from the beach. To rule out the possibility of false memories or the witness's desire to attract media attention, Thomas Campbell initiated an extremely rigorous cross-examination. The investigator demanded that she name unique distinguishing features that could not be fabricated. And the Canadian's answers became ironclad proof that Amy was not only alive, but was being held captive on this island. Carmichael described 4 specific tattoos with photographic precision, details of which the family had deliberately not published in the press. The witness clearly saw a purple Tasmanian devil spinning a basketball on the woman's right shoulder. He also described a black sun tattooed in a primitive style on her lower back, a Chinese character on her right ankle, and a green gecko winding around her navel, which had a metal piercing. In addition, the tourist unmistakably pointed out a specific, chunky watch that the family had given the girl. The probability of such a coincidence was absolutely zero. Carefully analyzing this report, Donna Willis reached a professional conclusion that was horrifying in its essence. The criminal syndicate had moved the victim to the most terrifying stage. The stage of complete psychological breakdown of the will. Bringing the victim under heavy guard to a public, sun-drenched beach crowded with hundreds of tourists is a classic tactic of transnational human traffickers. They deliberately demonstrate to the broken person her absolute helplessness. The criminals show that she may be just a few feet away from dozens of potential rescuers, but not a single person in that crowd will take notice or come to her aid. This cruel experiment was intended to completely extinguish any hope of rescue in the girl. Without wasting a moment, Thomas and Donna headed straight for Playa Porto Mari. They methodically searched the coastline, trying to trace the criminal group's escape route. Logic dictated that the kidnappers couldn't possibly be holding her in a tourist area. Deep tracks from an SUV's tires on the dirt road led them away from the snow-white sands, deeper into the industrial zone. The road wound through dried-up shrubs until it ran into a tall, rusty fence. Behind it loomed the gloomy, half-ruined hangars of abandoned port docks. It was the perfect blind spot, a place the police hadn't set foot in for years. Thomas cautiously pushed open the massive metal door of one of the dark warehouses. A sickening stench of dampness and chemicals instantly hit his nose. In the eerie semi-darkness, right on the dirty concrete floor, something glinted faintly in the beam of his tactical flashlight. The investigator slowly bent down, picked up the unexpected find, and felt an icy chill run down his spine. Response from Gemini. A thorough analysis of the evidence gathered during their intense work on the island of Curaçao revealed to Thomas and Donna the true, terrifying scale of the monster they were facing. The investigators finally realized that Amy's kidnappers were not some local small-time gang or a scattered group of marginal criminals, as the authorities had tried to portray them. It was a flawlessly organized transnational network, a global criminal syndicate that had sent its poisonous tentacles deep into the system. It was tightly integrated into the tourism sector, the regional port infrastructure, and the corrupt law enforcement agencies of several sovereign states in the Caribbean. Donna, relying on scattered information from her most reliable informants, uncovered a clear, chilling pattern of human trafficking that had been honed over the years. Attractive young female tourists from well-to-do middle-class families became ideal targets for recruiters right in the midst of their carefree vacations aboard giant ocean liners. Crew members, service staff, bartenders, or guest musicians unerringly identified vulnerable female passengers in the crowd. They would professionally gain their trust, discreetly isolate the girls from their relatives and friends, and then, using pre-arranged technical corridors on the ships, hand them over to shore-based coordinators. This invisible system operated like a seamless conveyor belt, cynically turning human lives into an extremely profitable illegal asset. By expanding the scope of her search, Donna discovered that the transit hubs, safe houses, and underground infrastructure nodes of this criminal cartel were located hundreds of miles from the girls' initial point of disappearance. The chains of criminal connections stretched across the ocean to neighboring islands, Barbados and Aruba. Meanwhile, the girls' relatives, desperately trying to find any useful lead, created a special website entirely dedicated to the search for their missing daughter. And it was here that cybersecurity experts, hired by private investigators, detected an extremely suspicious digital anomaly. An analysis of the website visitors' IP addresses revealed high, systematic activity from a single specific location. Someone was anonymously but very closely monitoring the progress of the investigation from computers located in the elite business center of one of the largest casinos on the island of Aruba. Thomas immediately headed there to investigate. However, when the former military investigator crossed the threshold of the luxurious gambling establishment and attempted to officially access the internet network logs, he immediately encountered aggressive resistance. The casino management flatly refused to cooperate, immediately called in reinforced security, and ordered the detective to leave the private premises, hiding behind rehearsed phrases about corporate ethics and strict confidentiality rules for their wealthy clients. It was a stark, chilling example of how a respectable, legal business, with its bright neon signs, was directly covering for a transnational criminal underworld. The situation became even more critical and unbearable when a completely different threat was added to the exhausting struggle against the invisible syndicate. In the fall of 1999, the disheartened, psychologically shattered Bradley family fell victim to a cold-blooded con artist named Frank Jones. This man professionally and extremely convincingly posed as a former member of an elite unit of the United States Navy. Using specific military jargon, complex operational terms, and skillfully forged documents, he convinced the grief-stricken parents that he had the exact geographical coordinates of a hidden camp where brutal Colombian cartels were allegedly holding their daughter. Jones confidently promised to organize and carry out a swift, armed rescue operation with a team of veteran mercenaries loyal to him. On the very brink of despair, ready to give their last penny for the faintest hope of saving their child, the parents handed over a colossal sum to the con artist, over $200,000 in cash. However, this entire spy story, from the first word to the last, turned out to be a cynical, utter lie. The con artist was eventually exposed by federal agents and sent to prison for grand fraud. Thomas and Donna were forced to spend precious weeks and months of painstaking investigative work unraveling this complex web of deception, physically verifying dozens of fake coordinates and listening to fabricated informants. This bitter episode brutally demonstrated the family's total vulnerability to vultures who had no moral barriers and, without a shred of conscience, flocked to the scent of money and another's misfortune. While investigators wasted precious time battling scammers and fending off the lawyers of corrupt island casino owners, The real cartel wasn't standing still. The criminals cold-bloodedly exploited this forced pause in the investigation to cover their tracks even more thoroughly. The ocean continued to reliably guard its darkest secrets, but the silence could not last forever. Very soon, a single accidental witness will find themselves in the wrong place, and this chilling encounter will yield new evidence that will make even the most hardened detective's blood run cold. January 1999 brought heavy, damp winds to the Caribbean coast. A United States Navy ship docked majestically in the deep-water port of Willemstad on the island of Curaçao. The sailors were granted their long-awaited shore leave after a lengthy ocean patrol. Among them was Navy officer Bill Hefner. Venturing a few miles away from the bright tourist routes bathed in neon lights, he found himself in a seedy neighborhood never mentioned in glossy travel guides. It was a shadowy zone of illicit entertainment, where underground brothels thrived, safely hidden behind the unassuming facades of old colonial buildings with heavily barred windows. Hefner entered one of these dimly lit establishments. Loud local music reverberated off the dirty walls, and the air was so thick with the smell of cheap alcohol and tobacco smoke that it was hard to breathe. According to his later official testimony, which formed the basis of a classified military report, it was there that a scene unfolded that would forever rob him of his peaceful sleep. The officer was sitting at the scratched wooden bar when he suddenly noticed a strange movement on the steep staircase leading from the upper floors, which were closed to ordinary patrons. Two young women were slowly descending the stairs. They were closely escorted by two burly men who were clearly carrying firearms concealed under their jackets. They behaved like professional escorts, constantly scanning the room, rather than like ordinary security guards. One of the women had distinctly fair skin and a slight South American accent, which stood in stark contrast to the typical local crowd. When the guards were briefly distracted by a conversation with the bartender and the second woman stepped aside, the white woman quickly leaned toward the American officer. According to Hefner's documentary report, her eyes were filled with absolute, paralyzing terror. She whispered her name barely audibly, moving only her lips. Amy Lynn Bradley. In a desperate, disjointed monologue, she begged the soldier for immediate rescue. The girl managed to explain that she had been tricked and forced to leave the cruise ship, and was now being held in this concrete hell as a powerless slave. The criminals had destroyed all her documents and were forcing her to work off a colossal fictitious debt, constantly threatening her with brutal punishment. This was the very critical moment when a single decisive intervention could have broken the chain of tragedy and pulled the victim from the abyss. But the officer was afraid. Instantly assessing the situation, he realized that he was not facing petty pimps, but ruthless militants of a well-organized cartel. Engaging in an armed confrontation in an illegal brothel on foreign sovereign territory would mean an inevitable court-martial, the ruin of his military career, and possibly the loss of his own life in a filthy alley hundreds of miles from home. Hefner froze. His hands clenched the bar in a death grip, and he dared not make a move. The guards quickly noticed the unauthorized contact. They roughly grabbed Amy by the shoulders and dragged her into the darkness of the long corridor before the officer could utter a single word. News of this horrific incident eventually reached Thomas and Donna through their trusted informants within the island's port authorities. The independent investigators understood perfectly well. If they officially requested a warrant from the local police, the corrupt officers would immediately tip off the brothel owners, as had happened time and again. An extremely risky decision was made to act outside the law. Armed with tactical flashlights and heavy lock-picking tools, Thomas and Donna organized an illegal raid on the building that very night. They crept silently through the filthy, claustrophobic corridors, where the air was unbearably stifling and sticky. From somewhere deep within, muffled sobbing could be heard. On both sides stretched dozens of cramped rooms, each only a few square feet in size, resembling prison cells with no natural light, where hundreds of powerless women, brought from different continents, were being held. Using the coordinates they had received, Thomas kicked down the massive door to the room where the guards were supposed to be holding Amy. But the room greeted the investigators with a chilling emptiness. The transnational syndicate had acted preemptively. One of the corrupt patrolmen had managed to sound the alarm to the cartel's leadership. The criminals evacuated their most valuable living cargo in a flash. To ensure the destruction of any biological traces, DNA samples, fingerprints, or personal belongings that could permanently link this specific building to the abduction of an American citizen, the militants made a ruthless, radical decision. The corridors were suddenly and intensely filled with the smell of aviation fuel and industrial solvents. A muffled bang rang out somewhere on the lower level, and the old building instantly burst into flames, like a cardboard box soaked in oil. The temperature soared to critical levels in a matter of seconds. The flames rapidly devoured the old wooden floors, turning the seedy brothel into a deadly inferno. Thick, acrid black smoke instantly filled the cramped rooms, choking out the oxygen and stinging their eyes. Thomas and Donna miraculously fought their way through the unbearably hot wall of fire, relying solely on touch, and stumbled out into the backyard, gasping for the night air. They were forced to watch silently and helplessly as the roof of the building collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a giant column of sparks into the dark Caribbean sky. That infernal flame became a chilling and overwhelmingly powerful symbol of their defeat at this stage of the investigation. All physical evidence, every microscopic particle that unequivocally confirmed the girl's presence on the island, had turned to gray ash, forever scattered over the ocean. Amy had once again vanished without a trace into the pitch-black darkness of the criminal underworld. The physical evidence on land had been completely destroyed, seemingly depriving the family of any hope of rescue forever. But the overconfident leaders of the syndicate had no idea that global technology would soon take an irreversible leap forward. What could not be found in the filthy alleys of the real world would unexpectedly emerge from a place where ordinary fire holds absolutely no power. In the year 2005, the landscape of transnational crime underwent tectonic shifts. Technology evolved rapidly, and the global internet transformed into an ideal environment completely beyond the control of law enforcement. Traces in the real world seemed lost forever, but the battlefield against the ruthless syndicate had simply shifted to the boundless and dark cyberspace. Exactly 7 years after that fateful morning when the girl vanished from the open deck of the cruise ship, the Bradley family received a message that made their hearts stop for a moment. A strange email arrived in their inbox, which had been specifically created to collect information from anonymous sources. The text was as brief as possible and contained no direct threats or demands for a ransom. Attached to the email was a single encrypted hyperlink. It led directly to a shady Caribbean website that cynically specialized in providing illegal escort services to wealthy tourists. When independent private investigators and the parents, exhausted by years of searching, opened the link, 2 digital photographs appeared on the bright monitor screen. They clearly showed a young white woman whom the site's owners openly advertised under the commercial pseudonym Jazz. She lay heavily on the crumpled sheets of a cheap hotel bed, clad only in revealing lingerie. But the greatest, paralyzing horror was caused not by the surrounding filthy environment at all, but by the woman's face and unnatural posture. Her gaze was completely empty, dark, and forever detached from reality. She stared straight into the cold lens of the camera as if her consciousness had long since abandoned her tortured body. It was the classic, documented state of a person whose will had been finally and irrevocably broken by endless months of brutal psychological and physical terror. Barely breathing, Iva Bradley moved as close as she could to the screen. A mother's heart needed no additional police forensic analysis. She instantly and unquestionably recognized her own child. Eva unmistakably pointed out the distinctive shape of the nose, the unique anatomical line of the chin, and the characteristic hair growth on the forehead, which had not changed even after long years of captivity. However, Thomas Campbell, with his vast experience as a military investigator, understood perfectly well that in federal court, the emotions of a grieving mother would never be accepted as compelling evidence. He initiated a complex digital forensic procedure, enlisting leading independent experts in facial recognition. Specialized, powerful software meticulously overlaid hundreds of biometric markers onto high-quality old photographs of Amy and compressed digital images of Jas. The computer algorithm ran continuously for several hours, measuring the distances between the pupils, the geometry of the cheekbones, and the proportions of the lower jaw with millimeter precision. The official result shocked even the most seasoned and cynical forensic experts. The system returned the highest possible percentage of biometric match. The hardware analysis unequivocally confirmed that it was the same person. But the most convincing, simply irrefutable evidence was a single microscopic anatomical detail that was technically impossible to fake using graphic editors or accidentally copy. Professional analysts, spending hours examining the printed image under high magnification, paid close attention to the woman's right hand on the bed. Her little finger had a specific, very unusual curvature deep inward toward the ring finger. Thomas immediately retrieved the old Bradley family albums from the archives and found several photos from a beach vacation taken a few years before the fateful cruise. In every original photograph where Amy's hands were clearly in focus, her little finger had an absolutely identical congenital physiological deformity. The probability of such an anatomical and biometric coincidence in two completely different people was statistically zero. Armed with this irrefutable evidence, Donna Willis began her aggressive hunt through a tangled digital maze. Her primary operational goal was to track down the real owners of the Caribbean-based site and determine the exact physical location of the main servers. But she immediately ran into a high, impenetrable wall of organized transnational cybercrime. IP addresses constantly and chaotically shifted, automatically jumping across dozens of different countries on several continents. The hosting services had been registered in advance in deep, closed offshore zones beyond the reach of law enforcement, and the site's financial flows was securely hidden behind a web of fictitious shell companies. When Donnie finally managed to contact the site's direct administrators through secure, anonymous communication channels, their official response was cold and impeccably legally crafted. They categorically denied any involvement in criminal human trafficking. The administrators brazenly claimed that all services were legal, that the women in the photographs were exclusively adult local residents working voluntarily, and that the controversial images themselves had simply been legally purchased from unknown third parties or independent brokers. The publication and analysis of these photos sparked heated discussions that lasted for days within a large community of independent investigators and journalists. Skeptics immediately pointed out one very significant visual discrepancy. On Jas's exposed skin, none of the specific tattoos that the Canadian tourist had previously described in such detail and for the record on the private beach were visible. There was no Tasmanian devil on his shoulder, no black sun on his lower back, and no exotic Chinese characters. However, Thomas firmly and thoroughly refuted all these doubts. He laid out dozens of reports from similar solved cases on the table for the investigators, categorically proving that professional syndicates always conceal their most valuable merchandise before entering the open market. The criminals could have simply hidden them under a thick, dense layer of professional theatrical or television makeup right before this photo shoot. Or, which was a far more terrifying and entirely standard option for cartels, all the tattoos had been crudely and excruciatingly removed surgically, burned off with a laser, or etched away with ordinary acid in order to erase the victim's past forever and make her subsequent identification as difficult as possible. This silent digital ghost of Amy became the most terrifying and most depressing stage of the entire years-long investigation. It unequivocally proved two fundamental things to everyone. First, the missing girl was indeed alive and was currently in absolute, endless hell. Second, powerful transnational syndicates had attained a level of unattainable, almost divine impunity, cold-bloodedly hiding shattered human lives and bloody tragedies behind securely encrypted offshore servers. Thomas and Donna found themselves once again in a dark, dead end, with nothing but a few faceless computer pixels in their hands instead of the real geographic coordinates for a rescue operation. The bright trail in global cyberspace vanished as suddenly and without a trace as it had begun, leaving behind only a lingering, poisonous despair that slowly consumed the family from within. However, while desperate cyber experts vainly tried to breach multi-layered offshore firewalls, sitting in safe, air-conditioned offices hundreds of miles away from the virtual servers, in the real world, with its dirty tiles and the sharp smell of cheap bleach, blind fate was already preparing a new, completely unexpected clash that would resonate louder than any digital alarm. Gemini's response. Irrefutable evidence, gathered by independent investigators over years of grueling fieldwork, had finally pierced the impenetrable armor of federal bureaucracy. Under the intense pressure of the accumulated facts, the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States officially assumed full control of the case. The status of the incident was radically and permanently changed. From now on, it was officially classified not as a tragic accident at sea, but as a proven international kidnapping. The reward for any credible information that would directly lead to the girl's return was unprecedentedly increased to $100,000. Agents launched a massive operation along the coast. The first actual arrests began. Several corrupt local police officers and petty port guides who had been serving the criminal network for years were put behind bars. However, the core infrastructure of the transnational syndicate proved too flexible and invulnerable. The cartel cold-bloodedly severed its weakest, compromised tentacles to preserve its vital control centers. After the scandalous publication of digital photos of a girl under the pseudonym Jas and the deliberate arson of an illegal brothel in Willemstad, the hot trail finally vanished into thin air. Thomas Campbell sat for hours in his office, trying to organize the latest, mostly unverified data that continued to pour into the government hotline. One chilling episode stood out from the entire mass of information. In March 2005, an American tourist named Judy Maurer was vacationing on the island of Barbados. According to her official statement, she entered the public restroom of a large local department store. In the dimly lit room, she encountered an extremely emaciated woman. Her appearance spoke of profound physical and psychological devastation. When the women were left alone for a moment, the stranger suddenly took a step toward her. A desperate whisper escaped her parched lips. She said her name was Amy, and she was from Virginia. It was a plea for help, uttered on the brink of consciousness. But at that very moment, the heavy restroom door burst open. Several burly men, completely disregarding the norms of behavior in a public place, brutally stormed into the women's restroom. They roughly grabbed the exhausted woman by the arms and dragged her out into the dark hallway. This episode clearly showed that the syndicate hadn't destroyed their merchandise, but had simply moved the victim to another island, away from excessive attention from law enforcement. 2 years later, in 2007, another alarming report came in, this time from the island of Aruba. The source claimed that a woman who perfectly matched the police description of Amy had been seen sitting at a table in a crowded restaurant. She was sitting surrounded by 4 unknown men who never took their eyes off her and strictly monitored her every move. The woman didn't utter a single word, but her gaze was filled with the same empty terror that had previously been captured by the camera in digital photographs. The local police responded to the call too late. The group had already paid their bill and vanished into the nighttime labyrinth of Aruba's streets. The cartel continued its endless game of cat and mouse, constantly changing locations, countries, and fake documents. At the end of their grueling investigation, Thomas and Donna stood on the Curacao waterfront, bathed in the bright Caribbean sun. A hot wind carried the salty scent of the open sea. Silently, without blinking, they watched as yet another giant snow-white cruise liner majestically entered the deep-water port. Loud music played on its multi-level decks. Garlands glowed, and hundreds of carefree young women laughed and sipped tropical cocktails. They were enjoying their long-awaited vacation, completely confident in their own safety, and had no idea that predators in the uniforms of the service staff were, right now, at this very moment, already carefully eyeing new targets. The slightly ajar glass doors of the balcony in the Bradley family's cabin became a terrifying symbol, an invisible line between the safe, illusory world and the bottomless, black ocean of true criminal horror. This case never reached a logical conclusion in federal court. It remains forever an open, bleeding wound in the history of modern criminal justice. International maritime law, with its outdated, convoluted jurisdictions, and the powerful corporate protection of multi-billion-dollar cruise lines, continue to create absolutely ideal, sterile conditions for the impunity of transnational criminals. They reliably hide the truth behind the deaf walls of legal bureaucracy, leaving the grieving families alone with their endless pain. Parents are forced to scrutinize every face on the street every day, hoping for a miracle that never comes. The ocean silently guards its darkest secrets, while the ghosts of the missing continue to scream silently in the darkness of illegal brothels, waiting in vain for rescue from behind tightly locked doors.